Hey there, and welcome to this week's live masterclass sponsored by Fader Jocks. I'm Brian Stevens. If you've not been on this, if you don't recognize this crazy hair that's 4 months overdue, not having a haircut, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate your patience as we get the stream up and running today. I usually say 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, or whatever the top of the hour is, and then generally by 15 minutes after we're going live. So anyway, thank you so much for tuning in today. If you haven't already, I would suggest that you either go to the Fader Jocks Facebook page, or what's easier to do actually is go to my YouTube page. And I didn't graphic for it, but I think you can remember brianstevens.com/YouTube. And you can see last week's masterclass on bass drum mixing using this Great Waves plugin that we're going to talk about again this week. And instead of doing like a 4-hour drum mixing class, what I decided to do was break this up into smaller sections. And that would give us a chance to really center in on one particular use for this particular plugin I'm going to talk about. So that's what we're doing today. Today we're looking specifically at snare drums. And I would throw that graphic up, but then you would go away. Or I would go away. But I will show you, here's what I'll tell you 2 things. 3 things. Number 1, if you haven't already, swing by faderjocks.com or in your favorite podcast app. Subscribe to the podcast. There's a few episodes up there already. I've got another one in the can that should be going live this week on Saturday. And over the summer, we're going to reboot the podcast, and it's going to be every week. And we're going to have all kinds of great people talking about audio, whether it's studio audio, recording, mixing, mastering, recording musicians who have their own home studios that are doing this professionally. Or we're also going to talk about, my computer's throwing all kinds of crazy things at me today. Or we're also going to talk about live sound. That's something we really didn't do in the very first incarnation of Fader Jocks. We didn't talk about live sound. So we're going to talk a fair amount about that as well. So it's going to be a great mix of podcasts with guests and interviews, and podcasts where I talk to you about a particular topic and give you some actionable steps, whether it's music technology or music business, any of that kind of stuff. So that's the first thing, faderjocks.com. We're rebooting over the summer, so now's the time to subscribe. And if you will join the mailing list today, then that will make you eligible for what you see right there, which is the Fader Jocks giveaway for this week. And this week we're giving away a copy of this great plugin that I'm talking about today, which is the Waves Scheps Omni Channel. So if you'll go over, sign up for the email list, we're going to be giving away a copy to one lucky winner, and that's all you have to do. You just sign up for the email list, and you wait for that wonderful email that says, hey, you're a winner. So we'll be giving a few of these away over the next few weeks. I really love this plugin so much that I wanted to be able to put one of these into your hands as well. That's how much I dig it. And if you can't wait, you can always go to faderjocks.com/waves. And did I put something up for that? I don't think I did. I'll just tell you about it. If you go over to faderjocks.com/waves, you can actually pick up this exact same channel Strip plugin at a very, very low cost. So you can watch last week's video and find out about all those details, or you can find out here, just faderjocks.com/waves. And so that's all the stuff I need to tell you about right now, I guess. Feel free, if you got questions below, to type them in the comments or in whatever particular interface that you're looking at the time. And we're just going to jump in. And this might take 30 minutes. This may take an hour. Who knows? So let me jump over. I'm going to show you my screen. For those of you who were with us last week, you'll notice that I've got the same session pulled up. We'll listen to a little bit of this session and give you an idea of what we're working with today. So this is the drum track for something I did a couple of weeks ago. All right, so you get the idea. So that's the rough mix of the drums that I sent to the producer after I tracked these. And last week we talked about the bass drum. and how I mixed those two bass drum channels. This week, we're going to talk about the snare drum. And the snare drum that I used on this track, if you take a look at the drum kit picture here, you'll notice that right there in the snare drum position, that is a 4x14 Ludwig signature, Carl Palmer signature brass piccolo snare drum. And it's tuned pretty high, not sky high, but it's high enough. And so that was the snare drum that we used. Beautiful kind of emerald green coated brass with brass colored die-cast hoops. So the die-cast hoops really do help give it a particular sound. So let's take a look at just the snare drum track itself. And my S3 is giving me some issues today, so I'm just going to be mousing it. Old school mousing it. All right, so here's our... Turn that up a little bit for you. So that's the two mics combined. Here's the bottom mic on the snare drum. All right. We're into that bridge halftime section there. So let's look at what I did here on this channel. Real simple, 2 plugins. Just like last time, we've got the Universal Audio Studer A800 tape plugin, and you'll notice that I'm not hitting it super hard. Let me go back over here a second. Just loop just one little section. I could definitely have hit that a little bit harder with the tape. But in this case, I'm really just using it for a very subtle effect. So we'll check it out with and without the tape plug-in, so you can hear what that adds. Without the tape plug-in. And that's without Scheps or the tape. Real subtle. Now I guess I could drive this up a little bit. And possibly maybe give us a little bit more. Let's put that in a loop a second. I could give it a little more juice, I guess. Now, one of the things that I've got to do to keep my gain staging pretty solid all the way through. Hey there, hey DK, how's it going? Hey Barry, how's it going, man? So to keep my gain staging pretty solid all the way through here, you'll notice if we look over at that fader, let's make sure this is not in, let's take it out of pre-fader a second. So you'll notice driving that tape machine as much as I am, I'm eating up into my headroom a bit. So one of the things that I do to make sure that I'm gain staging correctly through all my plugins is I make sure that I try not to let the plugin add too much gain to the signal path, because it's going to eat at my headroom on the back end. So you'll notice there's not a ton of volume change here. A lot of the perceived volume change is just some of the compression that the tape can do. All right, so again, real subtle effect, just trying to smooth off the edges on this thing a little bit, round it off a little bit. Now, let's take a look at Scheps. bypass it and you can hear what's going on. Then we'll go into what's happening in the plugin. And really, it's just a better version of what was already there. And again, all of the stuff that we're talking about, yeah, man, you got to get a little bit of tape saturation on the thing. I could go a little crazier, but there's a reason I didn't go super crazy on the tape saturation, and you're about to see it here in a second, Barry. So let me turn off all these modules for a second. Oh, you know what I need to do? Bump this up. Yeah, we were tracking the other day, so got all these plugins on. Push that up a little bit. All right, so one of the reasons I didn't do a bunch of tape saturation on this is this very first module, which is the pre-module. So I'm doing a little bit of high-pass filter in about 76. Now I don't want to go up too high because then I get into the meat of the snare drum. I'm really just trying to clean the bottom end up on this thing. Now I'm using the even order harmonics, and I'm about 38 up into the saturation. You can go crazy with this. Check this out. Kind of makes it fuzzy. Where you really hear the distortion is on the toms at that point, the bleed on the toms. The nice thing about the saturation circuit on this for snare drums is it just gives it a little bit more something to push it through in the mix. That you don't have to crank on the EQ necessarily to make it stick out. So that's the very first thing. Again, with the saturation circuit, like we talked about before, you've got odd and even order harmonics depending on the kind of saturation you're looking for, or if you're really going for something crazy. And I'll do this sometime with the loops, is I'll put it into the heavy mode and really go nuts with that. So the next thing is we've got this movable insert. We talked about that last week. And you'll notice here on the movable insert, I've got a few different points that I'm notching out. And that's the, if you didn't get to see last week, I explained that this particular plugin, this Scheps Omni Channel, in one plugin, or in this case, a plugin inside of another plugin, so two plugins, replaces anywhere from 4 to 6 or 7 plugins I used to put in series. And so with this one plugin, I can get just about everything I'd ever want done. In this case, I'm using that insert to put in a surgical EQ. That was part of the workflow that we talked about last time. So with my surgical EQ, I've got some very specific things that I'm trying to take out of this sound. And the reason I'm doing this with EQ and not manually doing it or physically doing it, I could put some tape on this snare drum. I could gaff this snare drum up and I could kill some of these overtones, but then I'm also killing some other things that I like about the sound of that snare drum. So it's a lot better to do this since I'm using no EQ going into Pro Tools. It's a lot better to do this sort of thing on the mix side of stuff. Sometimes when it comes to the surgical EQ, if there's some EQ that I feel like whoever I'm sending the tracks to will want to keep, I may bake this particular thing in. But in this case, not so much so. I know I'm going to mix this one. So, oh wait, no, I'm not mixing this one. I'm mixing the next one. But this rough mix is the rough mix I sent the producer. So this was the mix of drums I sent him. Let's take a look at this lowest band I'm taking out. You'll immediately hear. Tighten the Q up so you can really hear. I'm taking that thing out. And I'm using a little wider Q so I can grab some stuff on either side of that. All right. So that resonant frequency, there's the ooh down there low. I'll get that out and don't have to worry about that anymore. And then the other real offender, and this is where the tape would definitely, most of the time people are going to try and use gaff tape and get that out. Nah, a lot easier to just find that frequency, get a narrow Q on the thing, notch it out. A lot easier. And it also keeps the sounds that you're looking for inside, I'll move this over so it's not behind my head. I keep forgetting I'm over in the corner of your screen. So that's one frequency. The other one that I'm not notching out, I'm pulling a fair amount out, is this. We'll shorten that Q up, narrow that Q up. And this is just a natural ambient frequency of or resonating frequency of this particular drum, that even if I put some tape on that, tape's not going to get rid of that. So in this case, I'm pulling this Q out a little more. Overall, I'm getting a fair amount of mid-range out of this drum, because that's not where the best sounds are in this drum. In fact, that's where the most annoying sounds are. And the reason I'm doing this surgically at this stage is I don't want any of those overtones to affect any of the processing that I'm doing past this point, especially when it comes to compression. So I'm also doing this surgical EQ in this Q8, so I don't eat up any of the bands on my more musical EQ that you'll see later in the chain here. Now, again, just like last week, one of the things that I use my gate and expander circuit for is to do the obvious thing, which is to try and cut down on some of the bleed, mostly the cymbal bleed. I'm not worried too much about the attack of a kick drum or the attack of some toms. It's the cymbals I'm really trying to keep out of this sound. So that's what this helps with. And again, just like last week, I use the floor. This is with no suppression at all. And then I just adjust the floor to determine really how deep this is going to go. How deep is this expander going to go? If I go too far, I get into cutting some of the body or the backside of the snare drum sound out. It gets so far into the note that I'm losing a little of what I like about that drum, which is it has a little bit of length to it. So I'm just finding a nice place in that floor to get to control the length of the note. Again, I'm trying not to let anything be longer than a quarter note. If I've got any ring at all, whether it's a tom or a snare drum, or in the case of last week with the kick drum, I didn't want the length of the kick drum, that open kick drum, to go longer than a quarter note. It would bleed into the next beat. In this case, doing the same thing with the expander. And then again, I'm setting the release and the close. The attack is as fast as I can get it. Release and the close really are just adjusting for the length of the note. The floor is adjusting how much of the suppression I'm getting. And I want to leave a little of that. I didn't do a lot of ghost note stuff here in this track, but I want to keep some of that. But I'm getting a lot of the cymbals out, a little bit of the hi-hat out. Now, let's move over to the EQ. This is where a lot of the musical stuff's happening. Here, listen for a second. Here's with it. Pretty obvious what's happening. I'm dumping a little lower in the tone region, using the tone like a low-mid parametric. Some of this really just awful, mid-low-mid stuff. I'm getting rid of it, really focusing the sound of the snare drum itself. And then I'm adding some brightness. So up around a little higher than 8K. I'm putting just a touch of high end in there. I don't want too much because we've also got to take a look at snare drum that's coming through the overheads. Snare drum's coming in through the room mics. Those kind of things. If we make it too bright at this point, it's going to start to sound brittle in those other things, and maybe even harsh. So I'm just giving it a little bit of a top end to open up the top a little bit. And then in the mid-range, around that almost 5.5K, where the actual snare sound lives. So right there, got plenty of snare. Now you'll notice down around 120, there's a little bit of that, the lower body of the snare drum I'm trying to add back. it's a thin drum, so there's not a ton of that naturally in that drum, so I'm giving it back a little bit. So let's put it back in the mix a second, just to hear where we're at this point. Now keep in mind, some of that sound is coming through the overheads. All right, de-essers. What am I using a de-esser for? The main thing I'm using a de-esser for in this case, that nasty mid-range, man. If there's anything that the EQ didn't get out that it might be worse the louder that I hit the drum, then that's what this de-esser is doing. It's just making sure that we keep that stuff tamped down to a certain point. And then over on this other de-esser, going a little higher up, same thing. I'm really dumping a lot of that mid-range there. So if you notice, we've got this little speaker icon on the de-essers. I can hear just the frequency range that I'm adjusting for. Again, this is subtle. In this case, I'm really just trying to keep these particular frequencies at a certain level overall all the time in a dynamic way, more dynamic than a simple EQ will do. All right, and then we'll get into our compressor. Talked last week about my go-to, especially for drums, a lot of times first out of the gate is a FET, and this pretty much is what we're doing there. So we're doing about a 3-to-1. The thing that's cool about this FET, as opposed to any of the analog modeled FET style other plugins that you can use, is that you've got a lot more control, specific control over some of these parameters. In this case, I can really know exactly where I'm going as far as the amount of attack and the exact release on this. Now, if I pop open this little window, if for some reason I decided, in this case, I've got this high pass filter on so that anything that does get through in the low stuff really doesn't have anything to do with what's happening with the compressor. The main part of the snare drum sound that I'm using to set this compressor off. And in this case now, I'm really just trying to manage the attack of this thing. Overall, I mean, it's a consistent part. You can see by taking a look over here at the actual performance. We can use any compression going in. It's a pretty consistent performance overall anyway. But I'm just kind of using the compressor to manage maybe the top end of the dynamic range, but also by kicking in this compressor, like most FET style compressors, it just gives a little bit of zing to it, a little interest to it. I could way overdrive this thing, and if you really want to hear what the effect is doing on here, we talked about last week, the parallel compression built into the compression circuit on this plugin. This is what the compressed sound sounds like all together. And I could really go for, if I really wanted to crank down on this thing. The great thing about this particular plugin, having the parallel compression built in, is that I can go a little hard on the compression, and that might by itself sound a little bit too almost damped. It's almost so compressed that it's damped. Well, all I've got to do is roll the mix back. In this case, since I'm compressing a lot more, I want a lot more of the original sound in. Now we've got we'll do half and half, right about half and half, half uncompressed, half compressed. See how that sounds in the mix. Overall, what that compression helps do, between the performance being consistent and the compressor managing the top end of the dynamic range, we can make sure that that snare drum stays in the mix in a certain place and it doesn't move. In the case of this particular track, these drums need to sound like they were sampled from something and looped. They have the consistency of a loop. This compressor just ensures that. You'll notice going in and out, I'm not getting a ton of extra gain going through all of this. It's pretty well level balanced all the way through, so I'm not getting a ton out. I didn't want a whole lot of bus saturation coming out of this plugin super hot. And then I just kicked in the limiter right there just below 0 digital, just to make sure that, again, we're trying to keep that snare drum sitting in a certain place in the mix. Great thing about this limiter on this plugin is it's super, super fast. So it'll do its job and be pretty transparent. Where I'm really catching that snare drum is on those fills. Snare drum gets I get a little happy on the fills. They're a little bit louder naturally. This kind of manages that a little bit. All right. So let's run over here and take a look at the with the snare bottom. I didn't use the Scheps. I just used a plain old SSL E channel. And really all I'm doing here is I'm dumping all of the low end stuff so I can focus in on the sounds I do want. You'll notice that I did, how about I move this over so it's not, again, so it's not over behind my head. You'll notice I took out in that, 400-ish range, that real honky resonant sound, took that out. And then I added, in that sibilant region, I added a little bit of mid-range, kind of a medium Q, and then topped it off with a little bit of 10K on the high shelf. And here I am using some compression, again, to keep that snare sound in one kind of place. Also, in the case of this compressor, what it helps to do with that snare drum mic is it actually sort of widens out the snares. It pulls the point off. Hey, Evan, how's it going, man? Good to see you. Every once in a while, I got to remember to look down at my screen and see who's there. In the case of the compressor here, what I'm trying to do with it is I'm really trying to take the point off of the snare drum attack on the bottom mic and make it rounder or wider, rounder and wider. So that's just a fatter sound overall. So I'm using a fast attack on this thing so it catches it pretty quick. And getting as much as 6 dB of gain reduction on this. Now with the gate on this thing, originally I kicked it in and I was like, By the time I did all of that with the EQ and the compression, there was already some natural spill suppression on this thing. So you'll notice I don't have this analog circuit in. I don't know why. Mainly because it's a little less noisy when you don't use it. So I'm not really using the gate there. Put both of those together. So yeah, as far as channel strips go, if I only had one I could use, obviously I'd be using the Scheps. The other one that I think's an absolute must for anybody's kit is the SSL E channel. It's just a great utility channel strip. It just does a whole lot. You can really shape the sound a lot. It's got a little bit of a more modern sound than I usually end up getting out of the Scheps. The Scheps I can get for a little more classic-y kind of warm analog. This has got a little brighter, snappier sound to it, and just overall a little cleaner. Now we'll put those into the mix. I'll bring that back into the mix a little. Now that I've gotten that bottom snare drum mic all put together, you can kind of hear what that does I'm only rolling it in just to add a little bit of that crispy sizzle that we're used to getting from a bottom mic. Cool. So that's the snare drum, that particular snare drum on this particular tune. But one of the things that I wanted to show you, and we're going to close that for a second. I'm going to pull open another session that I am going to be doing some mixing on. Where is this one? Rough mix. All right. A few of these tracks I want to have to mute because you can't hear them yet. But I'm producing this one, so I can actually let a little of this one go for you. So this is a track I'm working on. Thanks, Evan. I appreciate that, man. This is a track I'm working on for a friend of mine, singer-songwriter named Mark Cavalli. And in this case, we've got the complete opposite for a snare drum sound. That was a nice high poppy sound, and that's how we would use that Scheps channel to really bring out all the great things about that drum. Well, this same process works really well when we're looking at lower sounds. All right, so in this case, one of the things that I normally do, I did outside the plugin. I did it before I even hit tape. All right, so let's look at the signal chain real quick. Oh, okay. I'm using the trim because for some reason the phase when we recorded this, the phase wasn't out of phase. It's just that for whatever reason, the normal settings that I use for what's in phase and what's out of phase. Oh, I see what I did. Okay, so this has to do a lot with placement of overheads with close mics. So in this case, as I was putting a rough mix together, the relationship of the spacing of the overhead mics to where the snare drum was, it just sounded more in phase when I flipped both of these. We'll listen to it without it, but for whatever reason, I thought it sounded better. So with this particular snare drum, let's find a whole section here. Kind of almost do anything, really. So let's save the... Oh, you know what? You're not hearing it because I need to put this into... Save this. This one was one I just decided to pull open while we were doing this. Let's save this real quick. How about I send that to you so that you'll hear it too? 15, 16. You should hear it now. Oh, no, 11, 12. Sorry. Kind of see. There we go. Now you can hear it. And that's with everything on it. Let's take everything off for a second. All right, so this is a pretty common issue that I have when I'm doing these kind of tracks. So this is a real Memphis-y sound. With this kind of snare drum, you can't, this is an 8x14 Rosewood snare drum. You can't hit this thing super, super hard because it changes the kind of sound. This is one of those where the performance is part of what gives you the sound. if I whack this like a rock drummer, it's going to have a completely different tone than if I let off of the snare drum and played at a kind of a moderately medium volume, maybe about, I don't think I was playing much louder than about like that. In the case of a drum like this, especially one that I didn't do a lot of damping to, you notice that in the case of that one mic, that phase flip doesn't change anything. This drum's pretty wide open. I might have had one little piece of gaff tape on it. There's a lot of that ring of the head. If you hit that too hard, you're going to actually choke the drum out and not get that. So what I did was took some of the part of that ring I didn't like out. And I did it before it even hit the tape. That was the reason to put it in line here. So, little trick, if you don't want tape to do any weirdness with the sound, bring out things you don't like, dump it before you hit the tape. This is akin to running an EQ as you're recording. So now I'm going into this tape. In this case, using this GP9 formula. I didn't hit it super hard. You'll notice the harder I hit it, the more of the thwack it brings out. I didn't want to bring out too much thwack at first. So that sets me up for getting into my Scheps. So real quick, we'll that was the surgical work that I did before I got to Scheps. Still some low mid I got to manage, but overall, it's not bad. All right, so let's look at what the plugin's doing. Go back to the beginning of this. All right, whole thing. Let's A/B this top snare with and without the plugin. And again, last week we talked about chiseling the sound. So after I take care of all the surgical stuff, I've got more sound here than I really need. I want to focus the sound. I'm not using the EQ to, hey man, hey, good to see you, Goose. I'm not using the plugin to do anything but carve. I'm manipulating the sound with the EQ. Instead of trying to physically manipulate the sound in ways that might have negative effects, I'm getting more sound than I need out of the drum, and I'm using the plug-in to shape it. Take off the expander a second. You notice that mainly what we're doing is we're giving it a little more impact. We're bringing out the attack a little bit more. And making it sparkle a little. I am going to put something in I didn't use before, though. All right, so go through the path here. A little bit of saturation on the odd harmonic, using the high pass filter around 86. I could high pass more and get some of that ooh out, but then I'm going to take some other sounds out of that drum that I want to keep. All right? One of the ways that I'm managing that ooh is with this expander. You notice I've got the floor pretty low on this. I could let up on the floor if I wanted something that was a little more natural. Bring a little length back to the note. Same thing here. Super fast attack. And then the close and the release, I'm riding riding the close and the release to get the right length. In this case, it's more like an eighth note. Ba, 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 ba. So by the upbeat of the eighth note, the upbeat of 2 and the upbeat of 4, the tone that's hanging over is kind of gone. Now, because I did that, that's why I didn't use another EQ to get rid of that. That ooh, because I'm actually using the expander to knock off the back half, about an eighth note's worth of that stuff. Didn't use the de-esser. You could use the de-esser, I guess, if I wanted to retain a little bit more of the overall sound. And the higher I raise that floor, the more I like it. But let's just say I wanted to use this. I could train my de-esser on it. And then you just adjust the threshold for how much of that you want to cut out. I don't want to cut out all of it because that's part of the body of the drum. Or I could go an octave up if I want to go an octave up. Because there's a little bit of that same pitch, an octave up. I'm not too worried about that. Once we put it in context, it's going to sound great. All right, so here, not adding any lows. On the tone side of things, about 300. You can hear there's a little of that actually. Since I've done all of this other stuff, a little of that low mid I wanted to add back just to give it a little bit more, width. Mid range, not using anything. A little bit on a lot on top. 5 dB on the high shelf around 10.5K. All right. Now, this is what really helps kind of make it all finally work together. Is this compressor again using a FET about 3.5 to 1, fairly fast attack. So it's actually taking a little of that and rounding it off. I could make it a little sharper by opening the attack up. I can make it really sharp if I just open up the attack and crank down on the threshold. But you notice it brings the back end mid range up, so not the best thing to do there. Pretty quick attack, and then roll into maybe about 3 dB gain reduction. Maybe it goes a little over on the fills. And again, mostly the compressed signal. I'm using a little bit of the uncompressed signal in this case. And I actually trimmed it back a little, about 1 dB, so I didn't hit this output too terribly hard. I'm actually going to bring that back a little bit. If I want to kick in the limiter, I could. I'm not anywhere close to really needing the limiter, so I'm not using that. All right, let me take that out. So immediately you can hear what all that processing does. It takes it takes more of the sound than I really needed, and it gets rid of it. It focuses the sound, and in this case, one of the reasons why I was hitting the drum the way that I hit it was so that it would have a certain kind of attack. And I'm using the processing to bring that attack out. That kind of attack I wouldn't have gotten from hitting the drum harder. Hitting the drum harder would have probably stunted the length of the note on the snare drum. More energy through that drum is going to actually make those heads vibrate less. It's a weird paradox that you only learn by doing. And so that was one of those where I just had to know, here's how the drum needs to be tuned, here's how we're going to mic the thing, and then here's how I'm going to hit the drum so that when I carve out the stuff I don't need, it's going to give me the sound I'm looking for. So I'll mute a couple of these instrumental tracks so we can just kind of hear the drums in context. I'll find out what's wrong with my S3 later. And till then, we'll just use the mouse to do all this. All right. Same thing. I'll put it in with the bass so we have a little bit of context here. Take all the processing out. And if I just crank it up, volume's not going to bring it back. You know, so I'm not really getting a whole lot by cranking on the volume. It's about focusing the sound. Especially focusing the sound and bringing up the good part of the low mid bottom in that drum. Gonna be a good single when this comes out in another few weeks. So yeah, most people would probably have listened to that snare drum and maybe reached for a sample that sounded like that. That's what most people in most home studios would do. They'd take a snare drum sound that they didn't intend to get, and without understanding what's there to work with, they just would have thrown a slate trigger sample or something on there to try and get. No, all the sound is there that you need. You just have to hear that that's the sound that you need. And then use the plugins to shape the sound into what it needs to sound like in the final mix. So that's not fixing it in the mix. That's recording things in a way that gives you really a little more than what you need to work with. Could I have damped the snare drum down and done a bunch of things to get close to that sound? Pretty close, but then I would have had to do some things, some other things to compensate from what would have happened to really dampen the sound down. I either would have had to hit the drum harder, or I would have had to do some things in the overheads to bring out more of that. In this case, it's like knowing how to tune the drum and mic the drum and hit the drum in a way that gives me all the sound that I need. Knowing how to work with it on the back end with the plug-in to bring out and enhance the stuff that needs to stay and dump the things that need to go. Just using the tools to carve like an artist. I will continue to use that analogy of a big block of marble, and you're just chiseling that block of marble to pull out what you need and get rid of what you don't. So hopefully that shows you a couple of different kinds of snare drums and how you can use this plugin to do a lot of different things. It's a very versatile plugin. You saw how we used it for a very non-traditional kind of kick sound, something that was a little funkier. In the case of this week, we've got a super high poppy kind of sound and a lower sort of tubby sound. And in both cases, the plugin really just helps to bring out the sound that you need. In this case, I'm not having to reach for any samples at all. No samples at all. It's just using the plugin. Using the plugin to carve out what I need. So I don't see any questions in the chat or the comments and stuff below. So I'm going to assume that I explained that in a good way. If you don't have this Waves, and in all transparency, I'm a brand ambassador for Waves, but I pay for my stuff. So I'm not getting paid to do these for you. I'm not getting free plugins to do them for you. I'm actually doing this because I really dig this plugin, and there's so many different ways to use it. And this is just my way to reach out and show you how I use it. Like I said last week, none of this stuff is voodoo. This isn't rock science, as a friend of mine used to say. This isn't rocket science. It really is just good, solid engineering, knowing how to use the tools to get the result that you're looking for. If it were anything special or any kind of voodoo, I certainly wouldn't show it to you. I'd keep it to myself and not let you have any of the knowledge. But that's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to spread some knowledge, hopefully impart something that you can use there in your home studio. If you have any questions here in the live section, you can type it now. I'll try and answer them for you. If you don't have any questions, I'm going to pat myself on the back for maybe explaining that in a pretty decent way. At least kid myself into thinking it. Or if you're watching after the fact, if you get a chance to dig in and use this plugin for a little while, and you got some questions, feel free to put your questions in below the video in the recorded version, and I'll answer them in the comments section. And so next week what we're going to do is we're going to do overhead and room mics. I could probably talk for 20 minutes about toms, and we may do a little bit. I may lump that in with some other stuff. I've got a section I want to talk about in drum mixing with parallel compression on buses, and a section I want to talk about with effects. And so maybe we'll put the toms into that, because I don't think I could talk for an entire hour about all that stuff. But rooms and overheads, I definitely could. So next week we're going to talk about room mics and overhead mics and how I use this plugin to shape the sound to get the thing I'm looking for in room and overhead mics. So yeah, I think my gate's a little bit too... pull my gate down a little bit. I'm gating my mic so that you don't hear the noisiness in my streaming computer that's sounds like an airplane taking off. Anyway, that's everything. I hope you enjoyed this. If you get a lot of value out of these videos, please by all means share these on your social media. Share it on your Facebook wall, email it to a friend, text it to a friend. If you're on YouTube, copy the link and send it to a buddy. Put it on one of your engineering playlists. I would certainly appreciate that. Again, this is knowledge that I want people to have. I want people to be able to use this kind of stuff to get better mixes. And that being said, if you enjoyed this and you didn't get enough information, there's a ton more questions that you've got, or a ton of other ways that you might want to use this plugin for your kind of snare drums. I'm always available for private lessons as well. So you can just shoot me an email, brian@briansteams.com. I should probably make a graphic for that next week. Note to self. You can send me an email, brian@briansteams.com. You can send me a direct message through whatever platform it is that you're watching this video on right now. We can set up for doing an hour or 2 hour private lesson if you really want to go in depth on some of this stuff, because as in depth as that seems, we just scratched the surface of what's possible. So I would love to spend time with you. You can shoot me a message, shoot me an email. We can talk about doing a one-on-one private lesson thing. Generally, I do those through Zoom, Skype, or actually here at the studio, we have a different platform that we're using that gets us actually a much better sound. So there's that possibility as well. So that's all I got for you, man. That's not even quite an hour. I think I went a little faster than last time. By the way, if you haven't watched or listened to the Fader Jocks podcast, make sure you subscribe to it in your podcast feed. Sorry. Lion's mane I took this morning is starting to kick in a little bit. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast in your podcast feed. We're going to be starting that up again over the summer. And by September, we'll be every week on Fader Jocks. So faderjocks.com. If you don't have this plug-in, hit faderjocks.com/waves. Make sure you go over there and pick it up at a substantial discount. And if you'd like to try and win a copy of it, and I have to throw that plate back up here for a second. If you want to try and win a copy, we're giving away copies this month to some lucky people. All you have to do is go over to faderjocks.com, sign up for the email list. It's right there on the mid-right side of the page. Just put your name, your email address in, and by the next one of these, we will have given away another copy of the Scheps Omni Channel. And that's pretty much all I got for you this week. Hope you dug it. And I'm enjoying doing these things. We'll do more of these. We'll try and make this a once-a-week thing. There's so many different things I would love to share with you. And this is a great forum. I can get right to you guys. I see people like Beard Piacente that I know, and Evan, and DK Brown, and Goose, Tom Seguso. Good to see you, buddy. Just all kinds of great stuff, man. Great stuff, great friends. That's all I got for you. I could just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, but I'm not going to because I got work to do, and another drummer buddy is stopping by in a few minutes. So that's all I got for you. I don't really have a tagline other than be good to yourself and be good to everybody. I don't know. Be good to yourselves and be good to everybody else. That's somebody's tagline. So, but I'm stealing it for today. Maybe by